the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
History as it happens, August 8th, 2024. Hezbollah.
There is supposed to be a ceasefire in the Lebanon, but it means nothing. The war has lasted 12 months. It has ruined a country and destroyed a nation.
For Khomeini, the flight from Paris to Tehran marked the end of 15 years in exile.
Israel's land offensives in both the eastern and central sectors are cutting off Syrian forces from their homeland and have put Israel in position to link up with Lebanon's right-wing Christian militias.
Israel did not invade any country.
What is at stake now in the invasion of Lebanon is the future of Lebanon itself.
This just in from Beirut. At least 40 U.S. Marines and 10 French soldiers are dead after 2 explosions.
Syrian and Iranian government spokesmen tonight denied that their governments had anything to do with those suicidal attacks on the American and French barracks.
That these deeds make so evident the bestial nature of those who would assume power if they could have their way and drive us out of that area.
Where did this Lebanese militia, backed by Iran and dedicated to fighting Israel and the United States, come from? Hezbollah is considered a terrorist organization by Western governments. It is also a political party that runs a social services network important to Shia Muslims in Lebanon. Its leader is Hassan Nasrallah, a turban cleric. Its military wing is stronger than the Lebanese armed forces. Who is Hezbollah? That is next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And they strongly believe that one day, Israel will eventually cease to exist, and they can be part of that process of bringing Israel to cease to exist. And they look at what's happening in Israel today, the civil strife in a way that's happening inside Israel among different factions, political factions in Israel. They see the division that are taking place between the secularists and the ultra-right Orthodox. They see all of these developments as signs that Israel is weakening, that Israel is on its road to implosion.
This is the voice of Hassan Nasrallah. Bearded, bespectacled, a black turban atop his head, looking like a scholar cleric, not a fire-breathing fanatic. It was a speech to supporters a week after Israel assassinated a Hezbollah commander in an airstrike in Beirut. Nasrallah promised retaliation is coming because, he said, the assassination could not be treated as an ordinary attack. Hezbollah might act alone or along with other Iran-backed factions. So this is why countries, including the United States, are urging their citizens to get out of Lebanon. Retaliation could provoke Israeli countermeasures, and the wider war everyone's feared since last October may finally arrive. An analysis for the Center for Strategic and International Studies suggests Israel and Hezbollah are already at war. Since October, there have been over 4,400 rocket, missile, and other standoff attacks by Israel and Hezbollah combined. The study goes on to say that shortly after the Hamas attack on October 7, Israel nearly launched a preventive war against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Israeli intelligence assessed that Hezbollah fighters were on the verge of crossing the border into northern Israel as part of a multi-pronged attack. The IDF deployed fighter aircraft that awaited orders to strike targets in Lebanon. The study says Israeli officials apparently notified the White House they were considering preventive strikes and requested U.S. support. But senior U.S. officials, including President Biden, pushed back. The CSIS analyst spoke to U.S. officials who are worried that Israeli strikes in Lebanon would unnecessarily trigger a regional war and were skeptical of Israel's intelligence that an attack was imminent. So fast forward to now, as I record this podcast, some kind of attack by Hezbollah is imminent. So maybe you're wondering, given what's at stake here, why the Lebanese government doesn't stop this from happening. After all, the 2006 war that lasted 34 days devastated Lebanon, provoked by a cross-border raid by Hezbollah in July of that year that killed 3 Israeli soldiers and kidnapped 2 others.
The Lebanese people were to pay dearly. Israel bombarded Lebanon from air, land, and sea. Mounted an air and naval blockade and a ground invasion of southern Lebanon. In response, Hezbollah launched rockets into northern Israel, an average of 200 a day for the duration.
This British Pathé video shows the utter destruction left by that war. Well, today, Hezbollah is still the most powerful military force in Lebanon, stronger than the Lebanese armed forces. Lebanon is basically a failed state. So this is the answer to the question as to why the central government there can't stop this from escalating. It is crumbling under corruption, poverty, and economic mismanagement. There is no president, and parliament, where Hezbollah holds seats, is badly divided. According to a report by Al Jazeera, about 80% of the Lebanese population is below the poverty line. 36% is below the extreme poverty line, living on less than $2.15 a day. It is impossible to explain Hezbollah's rise without the context of Lebanon's decades-long disintegration and the dysfunction of its central government. In A History of the Modern Middle East, William Cleveland writes of the years before the start of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. From 1970 onward, the cycle of Palestinian raids from Lebanon into Israel and Israeli retaliation in force repeated itself countless times. The Israeli bombing attacks affected not only the Palestinians, but also the mainly Shia villagers of southern Lebanon, thousands of whom abandoned their homes and migrated to the squatter suburbs of Beirut, embittered at a government that was unable to protect them from either Palestinians or Israelis. The relative ease with which Israeli forces were able to execute commando raids of their own, exemplified by a strike against Beirut International Airport in 1968 and the assassination of 3 Palestinian leaders in Beirut in 1973, caused an outcry against the government from Arab nationalists and radical reformers. I'm sure this sounds familiar. Cleveland goes on to say by the early 1970s, the suburbs of Beirut were surrounded by a poverty belt of at least 500,000 inhabitants, most of them rural migrants. Some had been driven from their villages by the Israeli raids in the south. Others were forced to leave the countryside because the government did not fund the irrigation and transportation services that were needed for commercial agriculture. The social and economic grievances of Muslims, writes Cleveland, were compounded by the sectarian arrangements that continued to favor the country's Christians. Long before the crisis of the 1970s, Lebanon's political leaders recognized that Muslims outnumbered Christians and that the largest single religious grouping in the country was the Shia Muslim community. The underprivileged and underrepresented Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, reacted to the Christian leaders' intransigence by identifying with the Palestinians, a community that was also opposed to the status quo. And as Cleveland writes, warfare between militia factions became a way of life, and the name Lebanon, which had once stood as a symbol of sectarian harmony, became synonymous with mindless violence.
There is supposed to be a ceasefire in the Lebanon, but it means nothing. There have been 28 ceasefires, and each of them has been followed by even fiercer fighting. It's now a year since Lebanon's social tensions finally and inevitably exploded into war. So far, the civil war has taken 17,000 lives. In the latest ceasefire, at least 50.
So there was fertile soil to grow a group such as Hezbollah. Israel planted the seed by invading Lebanon in 1982.
Israeli boats shelled the coastal roads to stop supplies from reaching the PLO, sending refugees fleeing from the no man's land.
For more on the 1982 war, I encourage you to listen to 2 episodes I produced in the past year or so. One is titled Finding Imad Mughniyeh. The other is When Reagan Pressured Israel. I will share links to these shows in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack, and you can subscribe free. So, as I said before, Israel and Hezbollah may be on the brink of war today. This militant group of Shia men came into existence to resist the Israeli invasion of 1982. Its written doctrine calls for Israel's destruction, and its founders widened their mission in those days to take on the United States as well. April 18th, 1983, a suicide bomber strikes the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing more than 60 people, wiping out the CIA station and its chief, Bob Ames. President Reagan vowed the U.S. would not be intimidated.
Let us here in their presence serve notice to the cowardly, skulking barbarians in the world that they will not have their way.
A few months later, the nightmare worsened. August 23, 1983.
The official toll now tops 160 dead.
And now the number is 191 in the Beirut massacre. 191 Marines dead in the explosion at their headquarters at the Beirut.
There are no words to properly express our outrage, and I think the outrage of all Americans, at the despicable act, following as it does on the one perpetrated several months ago in the spring that took the lives of scores of people at our embassy in that same city, in Beirut. But I think we should all recognize that these deeds make so evident the bestial nature of those who would assume power if they could have their way.
Soon after, Reagan decided to get out of Lebanon. Israel partially withdrew. Hezbollah stayed. They were a Lebanese militia. Randa grew up in Lebanon. She remembers the communities who produced the men who would join the Shia resistance. Today, she is an expert at the Middle East Institute here in Washington. She's its director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program, and she is a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, known as Johns Hopkins SICE. And she is here to answer: who is Hezbollah? What are its origins? Randa, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Before we dive into the history and the origin story here, why don't we just start briefly with what's happening today? How concerned are you about the war becoming a wider or a regional war?
We are at a serious inflection point in the ongoing war trajectory after the assassination of senior Hezbollah commander last week, followed quickly by the Israeli assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. That kind of escalation has brought the region now as close as it has never been to the brink of the kind of regional war that is far more expansive, more violent than what we have seen to date since October 7. I hope that the diplomatic channels that have been working in overdrive between the US, Arab allies, the US, European allies, between Arab allies of the US and Tehran, hoping to limit the kind of response. I don't see this response is going to be prevented by Iran and by Hezbollah, but I think what the diplomacy is about is to limit that kind of response, to make it less,
escalatory?
Exactly, less escalatory than it has been the case. And then once a response takes place, for the US to work on Israeli decision makers, including especially the Israeli Prime Minister, not to engage in a tit-for-tat pattern, basically pushing the escalation to a more serious level.
Because this is in nobody's interest. Israel, it's not clear Israel can fight a two-front war. Hezbollah is a much stronger and well-organized force militarily than Hamas. And I'm not sure Hezbollah and the Lebanese want a repeat of, say, what happened in 2006, that month-long war that wrought so much devastation on Lebanon.
Look, I still believe, I think the only deterrent right now to an all-out war of the kind we have just been discussing is the fact that neither Iran nor Hezbollah want this kind of all-out war. They are not interested in it. Iran is in the midst of a succession crisis, if we can put it this way. Hezbollah and Lebanon and the Lebanese are in the midst of a economic crisis and cannot afford basically another devastating war. Both sides, Iran and Hezbollah, do not want to go into an all-out war. And they have proven this to be the case by their behavior until now, since October 7. However, at the same time, they cannot afford not to retaliate to those two assassinations. Iran has been humiliated in a major way. Hezbollah is seeing that Israel is now going after its commander in the middle of Beirut, in the middle of its stronghold. And so they believe that a certain level of deterrence needs to be restored with Israel. They need to make Israel now pay a higher cost for its decisions to assassinate their commander and Ismail Haniyeh. And they need to, have this kind of response that on one hand will be costly to Israel, but on the other hand doesn't launch a regional war. Oh. And that's going to be a balancing act that's very hard to pull off.
Because it's impossible to control how your opponent might react to something like that.
Exactly.
So the origins of Hezbollah. The 1970s are really important in this story. 1978 was the first Israeli invasion of Lebanon. 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Let's start, though, in the 1940s. This post-independence for Lebanon, the National Pact, their government system. I think that's still relevant today. The division of power among major religious groups in the country. Sunni, Shia, the Maronite Christians.
These, the first pictures of the recent disturbances in Lebanon, were taken very shortly after French troops had opened fire on a large crowd of Lebanese who were protesting against the arrest of members of their government. Fears for the future liberty of the Republic not unnaturally caused immediate reaction throughout Beirut.
So in 1943, we get the National Pact. How was the country supposed to be effectively governed under that kind of arrangement, or balancing act, to borrow a term that you just used?
The 1943 National Pact and all following understandings that have amended that pact over the years until now have always been designed to meet the interests of a group of political and business elites in Lebanon. But these elites belong to the same confessional group. What happened is that in 1943, the understanding among these leaders who were at the time governing Lebanon, mostly it was Christian Maronite, Sunni Muslim, and Shia Muslim, was to divide the government, basically positions, among the three major groups. And remember, 1943 understanding was based on findings of the last census that was done in Lebanon in 1932, which was at the time, according to that census, 51% of the Lebanese population was Christians. And by Christian, we mean Maronite Christian, Orthodox Christian, Catholic Melkite Christians, Armenian Christians. But they were the majority, and 49%. Since then, Lebanon has not had a census. And partly because I think Lebanese leaders are afraid of finding the real demographic divisions today in Lebanon. But we people who study Lebanon, basically look at the voter rolls, because people in Lebanon are classified according to their confessional group. And so you look at the voter rolls and you can estimate what's the population today in Lebanon in terms of its division among different confessional groups. By the way, there are 18 confessional groups in Lebanon, but the four big ones are the Maronite Christians, the Greek Orthodox Christian, Sunni Muslims, and the Shia Muslims. And so based on 1943, the understanding, which is an unwritten agreement between the leaders at the time, was to give the presidency of the country to a Maronite Christian. The prime minister should be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the parliament should be a Shia Muslim. The head of the Lebanese armed forces and the head of the Central Bank of Lebanon, the two major institutions in the country, should be again Christian, Maronite Christian. And the division of seats in the Lebanese parliament, according to the 1943 understanding, will be basically 6-5 in favor of the Christian versus the Muslim, Sunni, Shia, and Druze.
And that arrangement holds to this day, right? Those are the rules?
No, it was amended after the Lebanese Civil War in 1989, because then it became apparent that the demographic, still there has not been a census, an official census since 1932. But after the Lebanese Civil War, an indirect admission by the political elites that the demographics have changed, then the Taif Agreement of 1989 changed the balance of power. So we still have the three main positions, president, prime minister, speaker, assigned respectively to the Maronite Christians, Sunni Muslims, and Shia Muslim. But the division in the parliament became now 50-50. And the powers of the presidency were diluted and reinvested in the office of the prime minister.
And in the Taif Agreement of 1989, we will return to that because that's the end of the Civil War, all the militia in Lebanon had to disarm except for one, Hezbollah.
Except for two. Except for two at the time. Except for Hezbollah and the South Lebanon Army, which was a militia, Christian militia, made up of former soldiers, officers from the Lebanese army that have basically deserted the army. This was a basically proxy Israeli force present in South Lebanon between 1985 and 2000, when Israel had established a buffer zone, a security zone on the border between it and Lebanon, and had the SLA, the South Lebanon Army, control that strip, that buffer zone, on behalf of the Israelis, along, of course, with Israeli military and intelligence.
So this sectional arrangement was upset, to say the least, in the 1970s. Would you say primarily as a result of the PLO presence in southern Lebanon?
We have to look at three factors, right? One factor is definitely the PLO presence. And in 1969, there was the Cairo Agreement, which was struck between Yasser Arafat, who was the head of the Palestine General Command of Resistance, and head of the Lebanese army, General Emil Bustani, brokered by the late Egyptian president, Jamal Abdel Nasser. And according to that agreement, basically, Lebanese army and the Lebanese government lost control over the Palestinian camps. There were at the time 16 official camps of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. The Palestinian Resistance Command took control over that. But also the agreement allowed, with the acquiescence of the Lebanese government and of a major Arab regional force at the time, Egypt was that force, the Palestinians were given the right to launch assaults against Israel from Lebanese territory. And over time, the PLO became a state within a state in Lebanon. And that was one factor that prompted a good portion of the Lebanese, led mostly by the Christian groups, Christian political leaders who have seen themselves as protectors of a kind of Lebanon, of a multi-confessional system in Lebanon, while it sees the Palestinian cause as fair and just, but they were not ready to sacrifice, in a way, the territorial integrity of Lebanon, the character, the multi-confessional character of Lebanon, in the service of what they felt was an Arab cause, right? Not a Lebanese cause.
Israeli retaliation into Lebanon for the Palestinian attacks was causing disruption, causing death, displacement.
And mostly it was causing disruption and displacement in South Lebanon, which has been mostly a majority part of Lebanon. I mean, the Shia in Lebanon are mostly in the south and in the east of the country. And of course, now they are in the southern suburbs of Beirut, where Hezbollah's stronghold is.
That's right.
But
so you said Shia majority. Southern Lebanon was a Shia majority.
In terms of population, southern Lebanon was Shia majority. And so friction at the time happened between the Palestinians and the Shia, because also the Shia residents of South Lebanon felt that on one hand, they are not being protected by the Lebanese government from the actions, from the Israeli actions against the Palestinian. And on the other hand, you know, the Palestinians are using their territory, putting their livelihood at risk, while launching their attacks against Israel from their territory and causing over the year, like in 1978, when Israel invaded Lebanon to push the PLO and the Palestinians away from that border area, hundreds of thousands of Shia Lebanese were displaced. Homes were destroyed. More than 1,000 persons were killed. Lebanese Shia. Now, as a result, Israel was able to push the PLO outside of South Lebanon, but by then the PLO has already established itself as a state within a state in Beirut, in the capital of Lebanon.
And the Shia who were displaced from southern Lebanon, they went to the slums near Beirut. And isn't that where the original members, if you will, or where Hezbollah could recruit people from? Wasn't that their base from the earliest days?
Look, a second factor in addition to this displacement, and you are right about that, a lot of them were displaced to areas around Beirut, poorer neighborhoods around Beirut, what we call the poverty belt around Beirut. Not only from the south, but also Shia from the east of the country came to Beirut, not because in the east they were being attacked by Israel, but because in search of economic opportunities in Beirut. The second factor, in my opinion, that drove the Shia into taking not armed struggle, but into opposition against the Lebanese state has been the economic inequities that the Shia have always suffered from. Lack of political representation. The Shia leaders who were supposed to be representing them were not seen by the majority of Shia as truly representing their interests. I mean, the leaders representing their own interests and not their people's interest. And in a multi-confessional system like Lebanon, leaders need to represent their community interest. And they felt, at least the majority of the Shia at the time, they felt the traditional Shia leaders, which had been in control prior to Hezbollah, were more representing their own interests rather than their community interests. So it was a combination of the Israeli attacks in South Lebanon displacing hundreds of thousands of Shia. It was the search for economic opportunities, and it was also a search for a political voice, which they found in one leader, which is important, which to understand before understanding how Hezbollah came, is Musa Sadr, who is an Iranian Lebanese cleric who came to Lebanon, South Lebanon, as a religious leader in the 50s and worked over the years, in creating schools, in creating job opportunities for Shia, then brought them together around a political entity called the Higher Shiite Islamic Council, which became the entity representing Shia interests in Lebanon, brought new Shia leaders, not affiliated with the traditional Shia leaders, into the fore, and then founded an armed wing called the Amal movement in the midst of the civil war, again to protect Shia interests. And that is the precursor of Hezbollah. These are all the conditions, political, economic, regional, geopolitical, that eventually laid the ground along with a leadership. You needed a leader to bring the Shia together. And Musa Sadr, with the help of an Iranian known by the name of Mustafa Shamran, who is also very important in the history of Hezbollah because he was the first Minister of Defense in post-revolutionary Iran, participated in the Iran-Iraq war, died during this war. But Mustafa Shamran worked with Musa Sadr in basically putting together Amal, which is the first armed militias, mostly made of Shia, with the objective purpose of protecting and advancing Shia interests in Lebanon.
So how important was the Iranian Revolution to this story?
Mustafa Shamran, he was the first Minister of Defense, was already working on the weaponization, if we can put it this way, of Shia political movements in Lebanon before the revolution. And then after the revolution, becoming the first Minister of Defense and then putting all the facilities or all the assistance of the Iranian regime in the service of Lebanon Shia. The second person who is important to understand here is Hafez al-Assad, who is the Syrian leader, because Iran was interested in sending its forces, Revolutionary Guards, military advisor to Lebanon. But the only way they could get into Lebanon is by coming via Syria. Like Syria at the time, remember, in the midst of the civil war, the Lebanese president, Sulaiman Frangieh, called on Hafez al-Assad and the Syrian army to intervene in Lebanon because the Christian forces were losing the battle in the civil war to the PLO, which was being supported by a group of Lebanese leftists, by an alliance of Lebanese leftists. In 1976, the Syrians intervened in Lebanon, and as a result, they acquired a humongous influence on the country politics So when Hezbollah came together after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, any kind of assistance that the Iranian would need to send to Hezbollah had to garner first the approval of the Syrian president. No foreign force would be able to enter that part of Lebanon, in the east of Lebanon, without the prior approval of the Syrian president. And then Hafez al-Assad gave that approval to the Iranians to come into Lebanon and work with Lebanese groups that were already armed and fighting the Israelis to form Hezbollah.
So there was a TV series last year called Ghosts of Beirut about Imad Mughniya, who the TV show's director, the producers, depict as one of the very first members, even the founder of Hezbollah. In the show, you see him as a very young man. I guess he had been Yasser Arafat's bodyguard or one of his bodyguards, meeting with some Iranian agents in Beirut after the Israeli invasion of 1982. And from that point forward, he starts to organize terrorist attacks on embassies. We all know about the barracks in 1983. And this was a fictional television show, or at least a fictional depiction of real-life events. How did Hezbollah get together? I mean, who were its founders, if you will? Because you mentioned how there were already Shia political organization. There was the influence of Iran. How does Hezbollah come together in all of this?
Look, the catalyst for different groups, and you're right, there are different groups who then coalesced around Hezbollah with the direction and the assistance and the support from the Iranians. The catalyst was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. These were groups, some of them were Islamic students, part of an Islamic students group. Some of them were former Amal members in a formation called Islamic Amal, right? Some of them were Hizb al-Dawah, a Dawah which was founded in Iraq, had a chapter in Lebanon. So some of its members were also part of the founding of Hezbollah. Some of them were former PLO associates, Palestine Liberation Organization associates. As you said, Imad Mughniya was closely affiliated with Fatah, and with Yasser Arafat. So it's different groups of people who were brought together by the mission of fighting the Israelis' invasion of Lebanon, and eventually formed the core of the resistance in South Lebanon that forced Israel to unilaterally withdraw from Lebanon in 2000. These were groups that are already united by an ideology of resisting Israel, resisting US hegemony in the region. In terms of ideology, they already shared that. The catalyst was the invasion, Israeli invasion of Lebanon, that basically pushed them to work together and collaborate. And the enabler was the Iranian post-revolutionary regime. Yeah. The guidance, the money, the weapons, the training. And over all of this was basically Hafez al-Assad, the leader at the time of Syria, also, who wanted to make sure that Hezbollah becomes part of this resistance front in Lebanon that helps give Assad and Syria more of a, bargaining position.
Yeah, influence.
And influence, but more of a bargaining position in its relations and its conflict with Israel and its conflict with the United States.
How important was religion, Islam, to Hezbollah's ideology?
It's more than just Islam. It is Shiism itself. At the heart of Shiism is this ethos of oppressed people resisting oppressors. This Shiite ethos is a core founding, driving force of Hezbollah. Hezbollah founding core was pretty much like 95+% Muslim Shia. And Shia have over centuries, have fought against Sunni caliphs who were at the time leaders of the Islamic Ummah in order to claim rights to political representation within that larger Ummah. And so that sense of oppression and that sense of resistance to oppression imbues the mindset, but also the collective consciousness of Hezbollah founders, but also of Hezbollah's rank and file. That's, in my opinion, more important than Islam in general. And they see their resistance against Israel, and they see their resistance against the US, which they find as basically a supporter, enabler of Israel, as part and parcel of this ethos and culture and history of resisting oppression.
So they weren't founded as a political party. They were a Shia Islam movement and a militia. And I have their 1985 manifesto here, their open letter. The necessity for the destruction of Israel, it says, we see in Israel the vanguard of the United States in our Islamic world. It is a hated enemy that must be fought until the hated ones get what they deserve. This enemy is the greatest danger to our future generations and to the destiny of our lands, particularly as it glorifies the ideas of settlement and expansion initiated in Palestine and yearning outward to the extension of the Great Israel, capital G, capital I, from the Euphrates to the Nile. Our primary assumption in our fight against Israel states that the Zionist entity is aggressive from its inception and built on lands wrested from their owners at the expense of the rights of the Muslim people. So does Hezbollah still adhere to these words from 1985 today? Is its goal still the destruction of Israel?
Until today, I mean, it's hard to say because on one hand, yes, they still, and in fact, now they would argue that their mission is in fact more relevant than before, given what has transpired in Gaza and the kind of destruction that Israel has perpetuated against Palestinians and the action that Israel is conducting against Palestinians in the West Bank. In fact, they would say more than ever, our mission of resisting and fighting Israel is relevant.
And then there's the other issue of, well, can Hezbollah destroy Israel? Well, of course not, but go ahead.
No, it cannot destroy Israel, but they're not going to say that immediately. But on the other hand, you found, for example, Lebanon in 2022 decided to strike an agreement, but through indirect negotiations with Israel on delimitation of their maritime borders. And Lebanon, the Lebanese government, which is under major influence of Hezbollah and where major decisions like agreeing with Israel on delimiting maritime borders cannot be taken without the blessing of Hezbollah, took place. So on one hand, you have the mission, which is very maximalist. But on the other hand, you have an example of a behavior that's very pragmatic and practical and involves negotiating with an enemy that, according to their mission, they want to destroy. I saw the agreement in 2022 as an admission by Hezbollah that we cannot destroy Israel, and an admission by Hezbollah that we have to live and coexist with Israel. However, I think since October 7, I think you are now seeing more a rise of the argument that we cannot coexist with Israel. But at the same time, realization that Israel cannot be destroyed, especially as long as it's supported by the United States. And so they're going to be facing this dilemma of how to continue this mission per their 1985 statement, while at the same time being practical, pragmatic, political actors within Lebanon.
And this manifesto, Hezbollah amended it in 2009. It does make mention of respecting democracy. There are some contradictory notes in it. Why did Hezbollah decide to get involved in electoral politics in the early 1990s when they won seats in the parliament?
1992, that's when they entered parliament and contested the elections. And before that, also they contested local elections.
Interesting.
And since then, they and Amal have been winning all of the seats in the parliament that are assigned to the Shia. Remember, the Lebanese parliament, you have certain quota of seats for the Shia, certain quota of seats for the Sunni, certain quota of seats for the Maronite Christian, for the Greek Orthodox, for each of these confessional groups. There are 2 points that are important in Hezbollah's political trajectory. One point is 1992, when they decided to enter the parliament and contest the Lebanese parliamentary election. And the other point is 2005, when for the first time after the assassination of then Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, they decided to join the cabinet of the government. And I think in both cases, they saw their political role, and they still see their political role in the service of their military and regional agenda, in the service of their resistance agenda. They never look at themselves, especially if you look at the founding core of Hezbollah, who still make up the core membership of their central committee, if we can put it this way, called the Shura Council, the Guidance Council. All of the members, I think the great majority of those members, are part of the founding core of Hezbollah. We are still with that group, right, who are now in their mid-60s to late 70s. The Guidance Council of Hezbollah is different from their military council, called the Jihadi Council. And Imad Mughniyi, the one you referred to, was head of the military council. So their decision to contest the election in 1992, and then their decision to join the cabinet in 2005, were done with their objective of being inside government in order to protect their military status, their non-state military apparatus. They're basically militia. And since 2005, especially because, remember, Lebanese politics were pretty much under the control of Syria between 1976 and 2005, when the Syrian forces were forced to leave Lebanon.
It occupied most of Lebanon before that.
And during that period, Hezbollah always relied on the Syrians and the Syrian government to protect their back. They saw themselves as ally of the Syrian government. And the Syrian government saw in Hezbollah an important element or tool to advance their own geopolitical interests in their own contestation with Israel, with their own geopolitical status in the region. After 2005, when the Syrians exited Lebanon, Syrian forces, and as a result, influence of the Syrian government and the Syrian leader, Bashar al-Assad, on Lebanese politics waned and has been waning since then. Then Hezbollah said, we need to be part of the decision-making structures, in this case, government, in order to protect our own military apparatus, in order to protect our own role in Lebanon, but also in the region. That's what always drove them to join the state structure, be it the parliament or be it the government.
And today it manages a vast network of social services, referring to Hezbollah, infrastructure, healthcare facilities, schools and youth programs, which have been important for Hezbollah to keep up its support among the Shiite and even non-Shiite Lebanese. I'll just clarify something I said earlier about the amended manifesto. It was an update in 2009. So it was 2009. It was less Islamist than its predecessor of 1985 and called for true democracy. Here's an article from the Wilson Center on Hezbollah's doctrine. Hezbollah rhetoric has made contradictory claims about its long-term goals. We do not seek the application of Islam by force or violence, but by peaceful political action, which gives the majority in any society the opportunity to adopt or reject it. If Islam becomes the choice of the majority, then we will apply it. If not, we will continue to coexist and discuss with others until we reach a common ground based upon correct beliefs. And at the same time, however, the manifesto does still say death to Israel.
Look, this is their core mission, which is resistance and resistance against Israel. It's their main enemy. And of course, the United States.
Yeah, it's not just a slogan, right? It's not just bluster. They believe it.
No, I mean, this is who they are. They believe it. This is who they are. They believe that. And they strongly believe that one day, Israel will eventually cease to exist. And they strongly believe that, and they can be part of that process of bringing Israel to cease to exist. And they look at what's happening in Israel today, the civil strife, in a way, that's happening inside Israel among different factions, political factions in Israel. They see the division that's taking place between the security establishment and, for example, the prime minister. They see the division that are taking place between the secularists and the ultra-right Orthodox. They see all of these developments as signs that Israel is weakening, that Israel is on its road to implosion. Now, add to that, they see what happened on October 7th. They see the fact that Hamas after 10 months has not been destroyed, and it doesn't look like it's going to be close to be destroyed, despite the assassination. Hezbollah, since 2006, has grown stronger, has more missile capabilities, has more military presence, has won the war in support of Assad in Syria. So they look at all these factors together, and that makes them even more convinced of the mission of basically resisting Israel, resisting US, and eventually leading Israel to cease as a political entity, to cease from existing.
Two more questions, Randa. Does Hezbollah still view itself as an international jihadist organization? Because in the past it has pulled off terrorist attacks in other countries. Buenos Aires, London, they attacked Jewish targets in those countries.
I think they see themselves at least as a regional organization, given the role that they have played in Syria after the beginning of the civil war there. They see themselves as an anchor of a regional resistance axis led by Iran. They have intervened in Iraq in support of certain militias, Iraqi militias that are allied with Iran during the US occupation of Iraq. They provided them support, they provided weapons to basically resist against the US presence. They have been helping the Yemenis in acquiring technical skills, the Houthis, in Yemen. And then we have seen this axis of resistance coming together really in this fight against Israel and the US since October 7. So they see definitely themselves as a regional organization. They look at themselves really on an equal par with states. That's how they look at themselves. They do not look at themselves as a non-state actor. They have been able to make war and peace decisions irrespective of what the Lebanese state wants. In Syria, they went to war in support of the Syrian regime, even when the Lebanese government basically adopted a disassociation policy from the Syrian government at a time when Hezbollah ministers were in the cabinet when they adopted this policy. So they look at themselves as regional actor that is on equal par with states and has power that is on equal par to some state armies, and that has a role to play eventually in how regional politics are conducted.
It's such an unusual situation because Hezbollah is considered a terrorist organization by the United States, the European Union, and others. So it's not like the U.S. government is going to negotiate with them or have an embassy in Lebanon that deals with the leaders of Hezbollah, right? But yet they are the most powerful entity in Lebanon. And we'll wrap up with this about just how popular Hezbollah is there now. Lebanon has no president. It has a caretaker prime minister, has a massive debt, has terrible poverty. It's close to being a failed state. Ordinary Lebanese people are fed up with not just Hezbollah, but the elites who've been running the country, and they're trying to put together some kind of coalition to win more seats in the parliament. What can you tell us about this effort? Because based on what I've read, Hezbollah's popularity is going down.
Well, it depends on what happens next. Hezbollah popularity is going down, you're right. But Hezbollah support for regional role among Lebanese, not necessarily only among Shia, has gone up by a few points in the last few months since the beginning of the war on Gaza. And so you're right, their popularity level is still low among non-Shia. Among Shia, it's very high, right? We are talking about, according to the Arab Barometer survey, which was done recently between February and April 2024, 85% of Shia say they have a great deal or quite a lot of trust in Hezbollah, versus among non-Shia, 30% say they have quite a lot or great deal of trust in Hezbollah, versus 55% say they have no trust at all. So yes, but then if you look at how people in Lebanon view their regional role, of course, the support among Shia is quite high, but it is low among non-Shia, like 13% of Sunni see it positively, 12% of Christians see it positively, 16% of Druze see it positively. However, when you compare it to 2022 polling, that support for Hezbollah in terms of seeing its role, regional role as positive, has increased by 9 points And this increase did not come from the Shia of Lebanon, but it came from the other confessional group of Lebanon. So if you have an attack, a devastating attack on Lebanon soon, you are going to see, of course, people rallying around Hezbollah. But after a while, you are going to see people starting to question why Hezbollah has been dragging them into one war after the other, into one mess after the other, especially that Hezbollah now is being seen as an essential actor in the governance structure of Lebanon, a governance structure that's seen by most Lebanese as highly corrupt, that brought the economic collapse of 2021, mostly due to corruption and poor governance. So until maybe 2018, 2017, Hezbollah was seen as this, fine, we don't like what they are doing against Israel, but they are not corrupt. Since 2019, when Hezbollah has basically brought its both political power, but also its military power in the service of protecting the interest of the governing political elites of Lebanon and business elite of Lebanon, it's now being seen by a majority of Lebanese as a corrupt actor, as corrupter of the parliament, as corrupt as, some of the leaders of the Christian group, as corrupt as, the typical political elites that have been governing Lebanon forever. So I think going forward, Hezbollah will face some reckoning. You have most of the villages in the border area between Israel and Lebanon, where the majority of the populations are Shia, and they are also supporters of Hezbollah. Most of those villages have been destroyed. The farming land is basically rendered ineffectual or non-subject to being cultivated again because of the use of white phosphorus bombs by Israel, which basically renders the ground not healthy for cultivation and farming for a long time. And these are farming communities. This economy in that part of the Lebanon is mostly agriculture economy. Where is Hezbollah going to come up with money to help these people rebuild? Where is Hezbollah going to come up with money to help the agriculture in that region revive? And then there will be the majority of Lebanon basically saying to Hezbollah, you cannot keep taking this war and peace decision irrespective of the will of the people, without participation of our elected representatives who are not part of Hezbollah. And so I think Lebanon is heading, post whatever is going to happen soon, Lebanon is heading towards a period of political upheaval, internal political upheaval, about the role of Hezbollah, the role of Hezbollah weapons, war and peace decisions, how they are being made. But still, there is no president until now. And Hezbollah has been able to monopolize political power, mostly due to the weakness of its opponents, be it the opposition that you refer to, or be it traditional leaders in the Sunni community or in the Christian community.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, how are we to make sense of the surge of right-wing populism across the world today? One of my favorite historians, Sir Richard Evans, has a new book out. I reviewed it in the Washington Times. It's called Hitler's People. He's not making any cheap comparisons between today and, say, 1930s Germany, but he does say learning how the Third Reich was made and sustained can tell us something about our predicaments today. That is next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
Are you ready to launch your career to new heights? Visit careers.dish.com/technician now and uncover a world of exciting opportunities waiting just for you. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, Dish has everything you need to thrive. Don't wait any longer to kickstart your next opportunity. Apply today and join the Dish family where innovation meets opportunity. Visit us online at careers.dish.com/technician. Your future starts now.